Hello, welcome to the March chapter of meeting for Access with SQL Server. I am your host, Juan Soto, Microsoft Access MVP, and we got a very special topic tonight. But before we get started, I want to share my screen and talk a little bit about some news. Uh, Something that caught my attention today was this chart that I'm showing you guys. Now, how long would it take a hacker to guess my password? Now, if you only have 4 characters and numbers, it's instant. A lot of these are instant here, a lot of instants here. So I'm like, okay, that's not good. So I'm gonna send you this link in the chat here so that you can use it later on. Let me just open the chat, the chat window. Let's see here, chat. All right, so here's the link to the chart I just shared. How long would it take a hacker to guess my password? So look at the number of characters you have. Now, in my case, I fell in here at number 10 with the worst case scenario, which is numbers, upper and lower letters and symbols. So it would take him 5 months to guess my password. And it's really not too easy, right? But it's not impossible either. Now, I use a technique where I have a unique password for every service and website. I have a base word, and I change it based on the website's name so that I don't have to memorize it. So it's a formula, if you will. I talked about it in the past, but really what they say is you should have a phrase, right? Jumping over ocean, car, right? And the phrase is it'll take many years to guess. So this thing would when you get to 18 characters, it'll take 438 10 trillion years to guess your password for a hacker. So I thought that was an interesting chart, so I sent you a link to that. The other thing I want to mention is Ben Clothier has come out with a fantastic post on our website about the new drivers of SQL Server. This is something Cesardo brought to our attention. He's on this meeting where he had a client of his. Cesardo works for me, by the way. We appreciate you coming here after work. Where he had a client that we sent him the links to. Oh yeah, just go ahead and download the ODBC driver and MSLODB driver. And what happened was he ended up downloading the newer versions of the drivers, and it kept failing because we would program, we hard code the drivers used in the system, and the drivers that were installed were not correct ones. And so we decided to alert Ben, and Ben did some testing. And one of the nice things about this new driver for ODBC 17 is there's a trust service certificate option there right here that you can now enable. And Ben goes on at length as to how what you should do and what he recommends in this case. Because honestly, you're better off configuring the server to force encryption, and if it's unencrypted, it rejects the connection. So that's the way we did it with the old drivers. We set up the server to enforce encryption on all communications. So that only prevents the man-in-the-middle attack, right? So if somebody were to sniff their packets between you and the server and put them together, they still couldn't put together the data because it's encrypted, right? So that's all this is. So it's avoid that common man-in-the-middle attack. Now, what I love about this article, it goes on to show you how to do the connection strings. And this is something really important because of the fact that this is what you live off in Access, right? Connection string. Now, this is what we have for 17. And then notice that it has to encrypt yes. And this is what we have for OLADB 18. OLADB 18 has got the provider, right? So this is OLADB 17, OLADB 18. Notice that this, between the 17 and 18, you can omit the encrypt equal yes. And OLADB, you can also omit the encrypt equal yes portion of that in the newer version of the driver. Now, so Ben also discussed, okay, when you should use a newer version of the driver. Well, my philosophy is you should always use a newer version of the driver, especially if it's a new project and your system supports it, because these drivers tend to come out with newer features for SQL Server Azure. which is what the focus is on Microsoft now. So if you want to leverage the latest features for Azure, such as MFA, multi-factor authentication, all those things, right? You should probably try and use the latest features. Now, I got a quiz for you guys. And when would you use the ODBC connection string, and when would you use the OLADB connection string? Anybody tell me when you would use this in Access, and when would you use the ODBC in Access? I know Soto knows the answer, Soto. I'm asking that too, but if you want to put in the chat your answer, I'll give you a few seconds so you're way here. When do you use ODBC and when you use OLADB? All right, so when you use the ODBC connection string and when you connect, for example, DSN list tables and when you have table links in your Access front end, so you would use this connection string in your code to do DSN tables, right? DSN list tables. Or when you're doing pass-through queries. Now remember, when you're doing pass-through queries or when you link tables, you're using DAO, data access objects. And DAO works with ODBC. However, when you're using ADODB, which is your preferred method when you're querying the server in your code, right? So say, for example, I want to query in my code how many employees are in the company in the employee table. I will say, okay, the query would be select count employees, TV employees, where status active, and I would assign that to an ADODB record set. Well, the record set requires a connection string, and you would use something similar to this, right? So this is where you would use it. OLADB is when you're using code to optimize that relationship between Access and SQL Server as much as possible. You want to use ADODB and bypass the DAO engine altogether and send these commands straight to SQL Server. So this OLADB driver allows you to use T-SQL in your code and send T-SQL to SQL Server directly, right? Versus when you're using this in a linked table and you query in Access, the ODBC driver is translating your Access SQL code to T-SQL and then sending that to SQL Server, because SQL Server doesn't know anything about Access SQL, right? So for example, when you want to delete all the records in a table in Access, just select star from table. But in SQL Server, you would say select from table, right? Delete from table, excuse me. So in Access, it would be delete star from table. And T-SQL would be delete from table. And if you omit the star in the Access query, you're going to get an error message. Well, what does the ODBC driver do? It looks at that SQL code and converts it over to T-SQL code, sends it over to SQL Server. But we had a session earlier this year. I would encourage you to look at it. That session on YouTube channel where we had a special guest. He used SQL Trace to find out that sometimes the Access database breaks it out to separate queries. So even though you're sending one query through the ODBC driver, it's actually separate queries that's being received from SQL Server. So there's another reason why you should probably use ADODB as much as possible in your code, or use a pass-through query. When you use a pass-through query, yes, you're using the ODBC driver, but now you're using T-SQL direct, right? So in a pass-through query, you can execute stored procedures and exec command. You can do action queries, and you can do SQL queries, right? Select queries. So take a look at this blog post. I think it's a really good blog post, and I, for one, am thinking about creating a blog post to follow up on this, just on these connection strings, because when I first started on this path of SQL Server and Access many years ago, this is something that was not readily available or obvious. Now, if you ever wanted to know about connection string, like say for example, you want to connect to Oracle with SQL with Access, right? You want to go is you want to check out this website. It's called connectionstrings.com. And connection strings, I hope I misspelled it. Yeah. Connectionstrings.com has every conceivable connection string you would use, right, to connect. So for example, here, you want to connect to Access. Well, this is the connection string for connecting to Access, right? Access OLADB, provider, the ACE engine, and so forth. Now, that's not what you would use to connect to Oracle because you're already in Access. You're trying to connect to Oracle, right? So if I come over here to this list here, and I look up Oracle here, right? And it tells you, okay, so if you're using .NET, this is your standard connection string to connect to Oracle. All right. If I come down here and I keep it, if you want to do Windows driver update using connection string pulling Windows authentication. Okay, if you're using .connect, this is what you would use. And so you go down here. Sometimes you have an access section. Sometimes you don't. Let me see if I can find an access section. Here I go. If I have an Excel session, I'll try that, right? Let's see, Oracle provider for ODB. Microsoft ODB provider for Oracle. That's probably something you would use with Access and Excel. So you could probably use this in Access and Excel. .NET Framework again. Microsoft ODB driver, ODBC driver, right? Remember, the old ADB driver is what you would use in code. And the ODBC driver is what you use with table links and so you got the old version and then you got the new version, right? So you probably want to use the new version. This is something that you would do, and then you would click on here to copy this and use that in Access. And then it goes on to no TSN or TSN required. It gives you this other example here, and yeah, so it's a pretty neat website. So keep it in mind, connectionstrings.com. I am going to put this in the chat window in case you ever need to kind of figure out a connection string with any other systems besides SQL Server. I think this is a good website to have in your back pocket. Now, if I were to go here to SQL Server, right? Okay, I want to connect to SQL Server, so I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to SQL Server, compact. Well, that's not really where I want SQL Server. Where is SQL Server? Is it under M for Microsoft? No, SQL Server compact. Why is it a mini? I got Excel. SQL Server compact. Why would it say compact? I'm a little suspicious when I see that. Here it is, SQL Server. All right. So here's the SQL Server connection strings. And then you have the ODBC driver, ODBC driver. So if you do ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server, notice that the latest one, 18, is not even up there. So we're ahead of this website. And then you've got this ODB driver 11, 10, 9. I mean, the prior one, 18 is not even on here, and much less 19. So if I click on this ODB driver here, and let me ODB SQL, right? And it goes on to explain the different variations you can use in that connection string. So I thought, you know, this is a website I've consulted over the years when I needed to connect to various systems from Access. So this is going to be a good one to have in your back pocket. All right. So that out of the way, let's talk about tonight's subject we all came here for, which is how to spawn forms. Now, last month I casually mentioned this in passing, and some of you guys are like, "Wait, what? I can spawn the same form over and over in memory, right?" And so the business case here was you have one form. In this case, I'm going to show you the forms. I press F11. Okay. I got two forms in the main menu and the one I'm spawning, right? I only got two forms, and the one I'm spawning is this one. So I'm going to put this in design view so you can see this spawn form. And all it is a blank form, but let's assume this is an order or an invoice form. Now, when I launch the spawn, I say, okay, spawn the form. I execute some code. And I have this random number showing up. So say, for example, this is an order form, or you want to see order 5795. Normally, the user will go to a search form, search for the order, either by entering the order ID directly, or searching for the customer name, seeing all the orders, customer orders, whatever it is, right? And then when they finally click, you would execute this code, which I'm going to be discussing in a minute, to launch that form. And then I can either go back to the main menu and spawn another order form, or here I can just click this button to spawn it. Now, basically, what I'm doing is I'm taking that object of type form and I'm duplicating. Now, you probably are not aware of this, but this concept is prevalent. You've been doing this all your time, since you ever started working with Access. You've been doing this if you created buttons, right? If I put this on design view, by the way, it'll close there's no design view, by the way, right? If I close this form, I can close this. There's no design view. Why? Because this is a copy of the form. It's not the actual form itself. So I can't design it. However, if I come in here and I click the design view on the form itself, then it closes all the other instances of the form in memory, and now I can do this. But I mentioned earlier, you've been spawning without realizing this. So for example, when I add a button here to this form, and the wizard comes up, I'll just escape out of that. I'm basically doing the same thing because there's a class that's called button, command button, right? And if I paste that multiple times, I'm just duplicating the same object on the form, right? There's one class called command objects, and I'm just doing multiple members of that class. So the same thing when we do spawn the form. Now, I call it form spawning because back then when we were going through this, there's this Marvel comic hero called Spawn. And but it's like it could be called cloning, and there's probably another term. I use the term spawn the form. All right. I don't want to say none of that. So one of the things that when I interview potential developers in my firm, I quiz them on these topics of the Access data model, object model, excuse me, not the data model, the object model, right? There's an object model in Access. What is the topmost object model? That's the question that sometimes I do in the interview. And of course, that's the Microsoft Access itself, right? So you can say dim applications access in your code. Nobody does it. It's implied in the background, right? So when I say dim DB as database, right? database, I'm using the second class in the object model, right? So at the very top is access. Underneath there is the database object, and then you got the forms collection, the tables collection, and so forth. But if you have an intimate and understanding of the Access object model, these things that you're going to be listening today make a lot of sense, right? Because these concepts are all very similar to the what we're doing here in terms of classes. So say, for example, I love using classes, and I'm going to show you my code here in a second. Let me bring up the code window. So this is the code window of the application. We're going to be going over that in a second, but let me bring up the Project Explorer. And this is important too, I feel. All right, so we got class modules, right? We have a class, so class spawn. Now, what is a class module if not a custom object that you design for your application? Now, this is not too obvious. Let's say, for example, I have an application that does orders, and I'm constantly trying to query the database for the customer attributes, right? So customer is going to have a customer name, customer ID, customer address, right? And so instead of in my code constantly mentioning the record set, dim RSS, dial that record set, right? Let me just go ahead and create a new module so you guys can understand this. Let's start with a simple case, and then we can dive into this code, because this is some very complex code. I want to make sure you guys are with me as I discuss it. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a module here. Okay, so here I should have an option explicit. That's the first thing that you probably are wondering, why doesn't he have the option explicit? All right, so I'm going to say, okay, get, all right, so the subroutine sub, get cus info. All right, so what we normally would somebody do is, okay, dim rs as style.record set, right? And then dim strSQL as string. Okay, and then here I'm going to say, okay, strSQL equal select customer name, customer ID, right? All the attributes I want to come back from the customer table. Customer address one, right? From customer TBL customers, where customer ID equal, and then maybe I use a temp var in this case. I'm just going to say ampersand temp vars bang customer ID to feed that customer ID. This is way too wide. Well, and then I of course I set the RST, set RS equal current DB That open record set and I supply the SDS equal, right? Perfectly legit, right? Correct way of doing it, right? But when you constantly have to get the customer information over and over again from your database, rather than do so, I got the set RS. That's one. Then I've got to maybe query if there's if rs.eof and .bof right? That means there was no data. Then yeah, I gotta alert the user. You have no data, and then if there is, then do an access sub, right? MSG box and then access sub, right? So this code is just getting longer and longer. And if you have to do this throughout your application, this is a big deal because if you have to basically get the same thing over and over again. Now compare that to when you create a class. So I'm gonna create a class. I create a class of CLS customer info, right? And I can just then, instead of doing all that, I'm just going to say sub test. I'm assuming that we created a class already. I say dim customer as CLS customer. Obviously, it's not going to be there because I have created it. And then I'm going to say set customer equal new CLS customer. All right, I got to do that. Then instantiate the object. And then with customer and with. And then here I'm going to say dot customer ID equal temp vars. Temp vars. Ban customer ID or whatever I put in there. And now it goes and queries the table, checks to see if there's any customer data. If it's not, it returns the user message box, and it comes back off everything in the object where I can say, okay, dot address. So I can say I can set my label to the dot address, customer dot address, and I can use customer dot address, customer dot city, customer dot zip. It makes it offload all that tedious processing to the class. And I can reuse that class throughout my application. This is something much more easier to debug and understand, right? So if I were to take over your application and you use classes, I get this. I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to really optimize your code and focus on what's really important, which is getting to the good stuff. Because querying the customer table over and over again is not fun. You want to get to the good stuff. Why is that you're querying the customer table? Maybe you have to create a label on an invoice, or maybe you have to create a label on the order report or something like that. So you can just create these methods and actions in your class and call them over and over again. So if you're a fan of classes and you use them in the Access in the past, the code I'm going to show you for this application is going to be very familiar. If you never use classes in your Access database, this is going to be a little harder to do. Now, I'm going to give you, if you stick around to the end, I got 6 people here. If you stick around to the end of this session, I'm actually going to give you this code. You'll be able to take this code tonight and use it on your own time and download the sample database and really go through it and understand the code and see how it works. So you're walking away with this code tonight, and then you can start impressing the hell out of your clients or your coworkers or your boss by spawning the same form again. Why would you use that, right? Let's say, for example, I have a very complex order form, right? I work for Boeing, and I have a very complex order form. As you can imagine, when you order an aircraft, there's millions of options. Now, you probably wouldn't use Access for that, but let's assume Boeing use Access and SQL Server for their order system, ERP system. And, that order form is going to be pretty complex. And so I'm a production manager at Boeing, and I'm in the midst of looking at this complex order I have to do for some country that ordered 20 of these. And then somebody else calls me about this other order, plain order. Hey, Juan, I'd like to talk to you about this other order that just came in through. Now, if you only have one form in your database, right? If you only have one order form in your database, what do you have to do? You have to close that order form, go pull up the search form for the orders. All right, give me the order number you're calling me about. Order number such and such. Discuss the order with the person on the phone, answer their question, hang up, close that order form, go back to the search form, locate that other order you were in, put it up. I mean, that's a colossal waste of time right there if you have to do all those steps to find an order. However, if you have spawning enabled in your database, somebody calls me up, I say, oh, yeah, sure. I leave my order that I'm working on now, right? I have this order number I'm looking at. 140, and I go pull up the other form, 7607, and then answer his question, and then back to 140. Boom, done. Boom. Now, a couple of caveats with this. Number one, make sure you're using 64-bit access. You can do this with 32-bit access, but you're going to run into memory problems. Now, I can spawn this form over and over again, and I think I haven't reached the end of this because I got tired of clicking the spawn form button. But this is not a very complex form, right? There is no tab control. There is not many fields on it. Really, basically, it's just a form with 3 objects on it. This is the form you will open the memory label and the 2 buttons, and then the code, right? But in 32-bit access, you're going to see, especially if you have a complex form, you're going to quickly run out of memory. And I believe there is a parameter in the code that limits how many you can spawn. So at one point, they'll tell you, hey, you can't spawn anymore because, right? So you test it in your application. If you have 32-bit access, you test it and you say, okay, this form, I can spawn it maximum 3 times. Because if I go to 4 or sometimes 5, it crashes, right? There's not enough memory. And so the last thing you want to do is introduce a hot new feature in your Access database, only to have your users complain, well, I ran out of memory. Why? Well, because let me take a look at your screen. Oh, look, you got 6 order forms up. And trust me, if you give them this capability, that's what they're going to do. You're going to have power users who are going to just love be able to open multiple order forms because you're the best ever, like providing that featured them, right? So that's number one. If you're using Access 64-bit, that's a different animal altogether. I'm not saying you can do unlimited forms, but that one does hold a lot more memory because these modern day computers come with at least 4 gigabytes. Most of them are now shipping with 8 and 16 gigabytes of RAM, and you can really leverage all that RAM and access to be able to access it with Access 64-bit. But the moral of the story here is you want to be able to test and see how many of the forms you can spawn in memory. Now keep in mind, a complex order database or a complex manufacturing database, I do a lot with manufacturing companies. You're not just going to have the order form up and running. You're going to have the main screen like this one, and then you may have a company record up, and then you may have a report generator up, and maybe you may have a invoice form up. And most people are going to have, if it's a great application and it's powerful and it's multi-dimensional, it's probably going to have at least 5 or 6 of these forms up and running. And then you're using Access 32-bit, and now you're giving them cloning capability. It can quickly run out of memory, is what I'm saying. So every person is different. Every Access database is different. So you want to make sure you do test it and you limit. There is, I believe, we're going to go over this in the code, a place where you can limit. If not, we'll discuss where you can put it in tonight's code example. Now, it's just not for the order form, too. You can have invoices. You can have customer records. The second caveat I want to talk about is we once did this for a customer. Well, we say, hey, look, you can open multiple records, multiple order forms. And they called me back after a few weeks. You know what they told me? Take that stuff out. We don't want to have multiple order forms because what would happen is they have a customer service department. I kid you not, 40 people. Okay? It was a large manufacturing company, and they're using Access. They since purchased a web ERP system, and they moved away from Access. But they have 40 people there. And what happened was some people were confused when they were making notes on the form. Now, they do medical devices. So as you can imagine, when you do notes on a customer patient record, it's pretty, there's a lot of ramifications to that, right, if you will. Legal ramifications, if the device fails, or they get sued, and so forth. And so what they found in that case was reps were having multiple orders up on the screen, and they were in the midst of an order, and somebody would call them, and they would go to that order, and then hang up with that person and then put the note in the wrong place. And they happen so many times. They say, you know what, just take it out because not everybody here can handle it. And so in that case, I wish I would have convinced them otherwise, but probably what I've done is said, look, well, we can set up a supervisor form where you can enable spawning for those employees who can handle it. That's probably why, if I had to do it all over again, that's probably how I would approach it right with that customer. So just enable it for people who can spawn, and those that don't, can't hack it. Well, they just don't spawn. They have to close the order form, right? Close search, open the other form, answer the question, close the order form, go back to search, go back to the other one. So those are the major caveats with this. You got to watch the memory allocation, and not every person is doing it. Having said all that, having said all that, uh, most users of your Access database, if they're fresh out of college, they're just used to this, right? They're used to browsers, right? I mean, think about it, browser. If we had an application order form in a browser, that's what people have been doing since the beginning of time of browsers. They open a new tab, and they have multiple tabs open in the browser with different orders on it. And that's the nice thing about browsers, right? First, you're disconnected from the server, right? There's no live connection unless you click a button, close the browser tab, or do something and save or whatever the order, edit the order. It's a disconnected atmosphere where you load the browser tab, it gets the information, it builds the web page, and then it stops. And this gets disconnected. At that point, it's disconnected from the server. Yes, there's an open session to the browser tab, but it's not querying the database or anything like that. Well, at least it's not supposed to. So these people are used to already having multiple orders up, and so now you're bringing that concept and technology to Access. That's just going to make you a rock star, all right? And you'll be able to really turbocharge your productivity. And that's what the bottom line. This is what this is all about. Bottom line is, and I've said this many times if you've been with this group, you are a business consultant using computer technology to solve a business problem. That's what you are. Yes, you're also an Access developer. Yes, you're also an Access consultant. But deep down, what you're trying to solve is a business problem. And by improving their productivity, you're solving a problem for them. And so being able to introduce the technology in your application to make them more productive is just going to be a win-win for everybody. All right. Sorry to get off track there a little bit. All right, let's take a deep dive into this code. Now, I rarely do this in Access SQL Server. You guys know if you've been, I rarely get into deep dives with code because my thing is, you can probably get off the web everything you need for the term regarding code or off the web. But a lot of you said, hey, I've never heard of this concept before, much less how to do it. So I thought maybe we go ahead and do that. All right. So I'll put this in design view. And again, you're going to get a copy of this if you hang around towards the end of it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I want you to, if you want a copy of this, you also can get it. Just go ahead and register for Access SQL Server group and send me your email. I'll verify you register for that group. And I'll send you the link so you can download it. Okay, so I'm going to put a breakpoint here on this, and I'm going to run it. And let's see how the magic happens, right? So I'm going to click spawn form. So we call this spawn form subroutine, and we're passing along a unique number using a random function. Why? Because you can no longer use do command at close, right? If you have multiple order forms up on the screen, and you normally would use do command at close when you click on the close button, or when the form closes, there's an action event that occurs. That's okay. But when I do the command at close, I should have do the command at close to access. And like, okay, you got multiple objects, and remember which one you're referring to. It doesn't know which one to do, so you get some random behavior there. So we have to create this number to keep track of it, and you'll see how that's used in a second. So this is a spawn form. Notice that the caption property is 94 and 95. Now, remember, if you're using this in your order database, maybe you use the order number as the number for that, but it's probably do, or the invoice number, right, or the company number. Okay. For each form in the files, what am I doing? I'm trying to check to see if that order is already loaded, because you don't want to duplicate the same order in memory, right? Think about it. They went and answered a phone call. They got distracted, went to lunch, came back, and they're like, "Oh yeah, they have several order forms up already. And they have this tunnel vision. They don't see that the order they're looking for is already open. You need to query the collection form, either through the form collection, and find out if that form is already in there. And if it is, then just show it, right? So I do the set focus there. Now, because we use random numbers, this code will never find that form. So it doesn't find it in this case. But if it did, it would set the focus to that form, and it would exit out. By setting the focus, it's like moving to that tab, right? And then exit function. I probably should have done set FRM equal nothing before I left that, right? I should have probably done set FRM equal nothing, but because this is a copy of the form, not the actual form itself, maybe it might work. All right. Well, it would work because this is the subroutine. So I should have done set FRM equal nothing, right? And then exit out of the function. Okay. Now, I added this temp var launching form. Why do I do this? This is a technique that we use a lot here at T-Impact. I wrote a blog post many moons ago, back when I had hair on my head, called Deja Vu. So if you query accessexperts.com for Deja Vu, they'll bring up that blog post. And what I found out with Access is when you open a form, it doesn't execute the code on the main form. It goes to the subform first and runs the load event of the subform. And that can cause problems because the main form hasn't loaded yet, right? So if your subform depends on data on the main form, it was all causing all kinds of problems. So I use temp vars, something like this, launching form equal true, and I have this if statement in the subform. If launching form equal true, then exit out of the load of the subform and let the main form load, and then come back and do the load event of the subform. All right. Okay. So the CLS is using the class spawn here, right? Now notice that we instantiated the object using the new keyword. If I didn't use the new keyword there, then I would have to have another line here. It says dim CLS as new CLS spawn, not dim, excuse me. Set CLS as new CLS spawn, equal new CLS spawn. But since I used the new keyword here in the declaration of the variable, I don't have to do that. And then I'm assigning that class caption. Now, what is caption? So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to set definition. And caption is a property. So I'm going to go back into this class right here. And let me just close this immediate window. And if I come here to declarations to see, I've got two properties, class ID, get and let, and I got create form. And if I go to the top of this, I've got this variable here called caption, right? So when in a class, variables are called are properties of the class, right? In this case, it's public, so it's available. So all I'm doing is I'm setting that property of this variable to a certain value when I do this line here. So let's go back to my example here. All right, so I set the variable. Now, once I set that variable, there's a subroutine in that class called initialize. So when your class instantiate and you set a property, as you can see that, it's going to execute this code only once. So think of this as the open event of the class, but instead of a form, it's called open class open. It's called class initialize for a class. All right, this form visible true. All right, so what the heck is this form? So if you notice, this form is actually a copy of the form spawn. So at this point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to query the collection form. Now, I have main form up, right? And so if I come to the front end of the database, how many forms do you see? One. But if I query the system or forms.count, how many do you think it'll say? It'll say 2, right? And so I say, okay, what is the first form? Remember, it starts with 0.name. So it's main menu. Okay, what's the second one called? So forms 1 name, right? It's called FRM spawn. So this version of the code loads the form invisible. We haven't gotten to that code yet, but when the main form opens, and maybe I can just show it to you. When the main form opens, which is when the database starts up, let's go. This one doesn't have option explicit either. Doggone it. Make sure yours has option explicit. So I'm going to go into the, here, let me see here. Give me a second. From here. When the system starts, the main form opens up, it loads the form spawn as hidden. This is an older technique. We've optimized it where we don't have to hold it, but I felt it was just too complex. Ben was our architect. He has since run away with this whole spawning technique. And his spawning technique is so high level, I felt more comfortable explaining this one to you because this is the one I created when I went down this journey. And I'm giving this to you guys. We use a more optimized version of this at IT Impact, that where we don't have to launch the form hidden view. So that's why you have two counts, because it's launching the form hidden. So if you had an order form, you would have the order form hidden. If you had an invoice form that you want to spawn, you had. So the first instance of your form is going to be hidden, and you want to set the instance to where 1 equals 0, so it doesn't load any there, because nobody's going to use it, nobody's going to see it, right? You launch it hidden view, and now since nobody's going to be using it or viewing it, you want to make sure it doesn't query the database. That's what I'm saying. Let me see if I press F8. Yeah, it takes me back there. Okay. All right. So that's what this. So it makes the form visible, equal true. This class ID. Now, class ID is a string, and right now it's being used with initialize. The caption is initialize, right? So now the caption of that form is initialized. And I exit out here. So what this does, this class initialization does, is it actually spawns the form. So here's where the magic happens, right? When I go, when I do this form as new form spawn. Now in your case, it will not say form spawn. It would say FRM order, FRM invoice, right? So keep in mind that you would have a different class for every form that you want to spawn. So in this case, it's called spawn. Just do a Control H. Everywhere it says FRM spawn, call it FRM order, or FRM invoice, or FRM customer, whatever you want to enable in yours. Okay, so now I've created the form memory, right? And if I do the form count, how many do you think I have? Now I got 3. Why do I have 3? I've got the main menu, I got the one that's hidden, right? And I've got the one that spawned, right? 3. If I go to the front end, still, see, it says initialize, right? Remember, there's one that's hidden. So I got initialized, still doesn't have the order number. And then we've got this create form. I don't remember exactly what this does. So let's go through this. So create form. This form, right? So we make it visible. Initialize this form that caption. All right. So this may look redundant here. And then I've used this class ID key column count. What am I doing here? Column.count. What is column? Definition. Oh, it's a collection. All right. So we're using a collection in this thing where we're keeping these members, these copies, if you want a collection. So when we want to close a member, we take it out of the collection, and that closes the form by itself. So we're using a collection to have containers of these forms in the collection, and we manage a collection. And when we want to close an order form, the user closes it because they made a change to the order, or they're done viewing this information, right? Or whatever they're done with the order. We remove from the collection, and then it gets removed from memory. And here I'm doing the bar class ID. All right, so let's see what this is. All right, key 1. All right, so the first one is key 1. The next one would be key 2, key 3, key 4, so forth. All right, CLS.class ID. Remember that CLS is, so we created this class ID. Now we're assigning this class ID to the collection. Properly led class ID, right? So that's the class ID of this form. So this class ID value, which is key 1. And this form, that class ID, we assign a class ID here too as well. And we got the lit class. Okay. So we've done that here. We're done with that property. Now we're going to add it to the collection. We're going to add what? The object, right? CLS, and the key to define. So this key 1 is associated with this object. And then we set the CLS to nothing. We don't need it anymore. And the function itself. And then we're done loading the form. And there it is, right? 9495. So several concepts you need to keep in mind here. Number 1, don't get too frustrated if this looks like too much of a hassle, right? Because again, you're going to be the rock star. And I always have this image in my mind when I was walking through that when I walked through that customer service department, 40 people, right? Most of them knew me, and hey Juan, how you doing? They were happy to see me because they knew I was bringing something great, something new to the application, something that saved them time. When I first started working with them, the prior Access developer did not know much about SQL Server. They didn't know how to use views. They didn't know, but basically didn't know anything about SQL Server. They didn't know how to use views. They didn't know how to use store procedures. And they were literally waiting 30 seconds every time they went to pull up an order. So they would click, wait 30 seconds. And I've told the story in the past, but I was telling a story to my wife, and she's like, oh, 30 seconds doesn't sound so much. And I say 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. By the time I got to 1015, she's like, okay, you can stop. It's a long time. I keep going until 16, 1000. So, by the time I got to 1030, she was ready to kill me. So 30 seconds is a long time. And if you have to multiply that times all the times that they have to look at orders throughout the day, that's a lot of wasted time times 40 people, right? So 30 seconds, if you have to see 10 orders, that's 3 minutes. If you have to see 20 orders, that's 6 minutes. And 6 minutes times 40, right? 6 times 40 is 240 minutes in one day. If you divide 240 minutes by 60 minutes, how many hours would that be? So 240 minutes divided by 60, 240, 240 divided by 60 is, oh gosh, hold on a second. My keyboard is not working right. 240. All right, divided by 60. There you go. Okay, 60. That's 4 hours a day. 4 hours times 5 days a week, that's 20 hours. 20 hours times 4 weeks. 4 weeks out of the month, that's 80 hours. That's 2 weeks of work. Just waiting 30 seconds for an order to come up across 40 people. So when I took over the system, I optimized the hell out of it, and it took 3 seconds to load the form. And so, of course, right away, well, here comes the man of the hour, and I felt like I was John Travolta at the beginning of Saturday Night Live, walking down the street with a can of oil can of paint as I walked through that department. I started talking to people, high-fiving people, and all that. And I imagine myself with those wide-bottom pants and the music, Saturday Night Live music in my head, because I was the man. Because I came in there and optimized it. Then I was the man again when I launched the spawning, only to have it taken away from me in that particular instance. But this is worth the effort on your part. Number one, you're going to gain great insights into the Access object model that you may have not gotten until now. And number two, it's really can be a productivity increase to your clients. Remember, you're a business consultant solving a business problem. In this case, productivity. All right. Great. So I'm going to launch. So this is basically, so I have to go back. So I'm going to have multiple forms here. Now I'm going to go back into this form, the spawn form, put in design view. Remember, when I do that, it destroys all those objects in memory. And I'm going to look at this code here, close form. Let's take a look at that. All right, so this close form is a save prompt. So it's prompting object close window. So all it's doing is closing window, which I don't know why we use a macro here, because I always tell my people don't use macros. So on the close event, so let's take a look at what happens on the close event from the class perspective. So here, if I go into the class, right, I got to initialize, get, let, create form. Let's see, is it here? Is it in the other, somewhere here? Let me look at the module spawn. Spawn form. One second. Bear with me here a second while I go through this real quick. Somewhere is closing that form. So create class test, spawn form. That's all that is, just spawning the form. And here, I've got the class initialize, get class ID, the class ID, create form. Somewhere it's closing that form. Let's take a look at this here. Click unload. Okay, this is where it's going, right? And the unload event of the form, this class or this class ID equal nothing, then remove, right? So remove it from the collection, and that removes it from memory. because the collection has the actual form object in this collection. So we already remember, if you go back to this, if I go back to this collection variable in the definition, this collection variable is defined in the module spawn, and I'm using it to store two things. I'm using it to store the object itself and then the key value. And the key value is the one that's going to. So I'm going to put a break on there, and let's go ahead and take a look, see how that works. Let me remove all the breaks first, and then debug, clear all breakpoints, and then I just want to break here because otherwise it'll just run that form. All right, so I'll close that, and I'll spawn form, spawn form, spawn form, spawn form. How many items do I have in my collection? I've got 4, right? So if I come back to Control G, and I do, okay, col.count, I got 4 items, right? Because I spawned 4 items, right? All right, now I'm going to close this one. I'm closing which number? 4687. So I'm going to close 4687. I can cancel this if I need to. The unload, right? And I say, I basically say if this class ID equals 0, for whatever reason, you lost track of the key and there's no key, then it won't remove it. But in this case, it does have a key 4. And I'm using the remove method of the collection, and I pass along this key 4, and that effectively unloads a form from memory and it's gone. So yeah, so basically let's go over this code one more time because I want to make sure that how would you customize this for orders and invoices and all that, right? Again, we talked about having a class here that does initialization, and then you have this form. Now, actually, I told you originally you have to have a class for each object. You do not have to have a class. So, for example, here, if I say private this order as new form. Okay, I would have to have a FIREM order. Let's assume I do have an FIREM order, right? And then I have, oh boy, then I have, okay, why don't you go ahead and do that? So basically, I'm gonna unload everything here. Let me just unload everything here. Okay, everything's unloaded, great. All right, so now let me go back to where I was. Okay, so I got order, and then I got private this invoice, right? As new form underscore FRM invoice, right? And so on and so forth into every object. And then when you do here the class initialize, you can't just initialize a form. You have to pass along. So you have to modify this class. The way I would do this is I would modify initialization procedure, say, okay, which one am I want to initialize? The customer form, the invoice form, or have you. So you could use the same class for all your forms. Just make sure you pass along what kind of object you're trying to duplicate. Remember the order for object, the invoice object, what have you, right? I'm sure you'll have some challenges to incorporate this, but that's part of the journey, right? I want to give you the fishing rod. I don't want to give you a fish. I'll give you the fishing rod, show you how to fish, and then you can catch your own fish. So basically, I'm giving you the fishing rod. Modify the code to your needs as you see fit, and be able to do this. Now, code from expert reply. So this is where we first got this. So you may want to check this article if it's still available. I don't know if it is, but we did reference that in our code there. We since moved on from this version and do this. All right, so that's form spawning. Let's go ahead and open up to what do you guys think about this technique? Have you used something similar in your case? Not used it? Do you guys like what you see? Let's go ahead and open up your mics and tell me what you guys think.
Well, I have heard talk about it, but that's the first time I've actually seen it in action. So that's pretty cool.
Nice. What do you think? You see it being something that you could use in applications going forward?
Well, not myself personally, you know my situation, but the last client that I worked for, it was not uncommon to walk into their office and see one of their reps with 2 different copies of the Access whole front end on side by side on their monitor, and they would work back and forth between those 2 separate. They had the whole front end open twice or sometimes 3 times. So I can see
Yes, that's what normally people do. You're right. They normally run the front. You can basically run the front end. Most 99% of the time you can do that, right? Sometimes you can't. And we have a code base at IT Impact where we can enable, disable that, because there are certain situations where you can't allow the user to have multiple front ends. But in that case, yeah, you can have multiple front ends. But this is a lot less overhead on the memory constraints on the computer.
Oh yeah, I
Right.
can see where they would have benefited a lot from just being able to quickly say, the phone rings, you check the order, you come right back. No, yeah.
Yes. And these newer computers, a lot of them come with 16 gig of RAM, and they can handle it, especially if it's Office 64-bit. Well, anybody else would like to comment or have any questions on this technique? I don't see any questions in the chat there. Chuck, Julian, Alphonse, thank you for showing up. All right, so here's the link to download the file. So George, can you copy the comments for the video, but don't include the last one. So again, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, go register for our when you register which is free, you'll get a newsletter and announcements every time we have a new session. And keep in the loop of, and you can register and register multiple chapters, Access Pacific, which George heads. You heard it in this recording, and it's great. I want you to register, and then you'll get this link. Okay, so it looks like we have no more questions from the audience. I want to thank you one more time for being a part of this great chapter. Still don't know what I'm going to be talking about next month, April, and then May is going to be our last session of the year before we have our extended summer break, where we have June, July, and August off, 3 months off, and then we're back in September. Please note we have Access Europe that launched, so if you're from Europe, you may want to check out that chapter. But this has been Juan Soto saying so long from the Caribbean. And thank you again for coming, and we'll see you next month in April. April, the second Tuesday of the month in April. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good
Thank you,
night.
Juan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.